Hey guys, welcome back to MFO. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. Last week we did an advanced bass fishing quiz. If you haven't taken it, you got to go back and check that out. I think it's a lot of fun. I also think it's chock full of information that would be useful to you as a bass fisherman. But I do have to say that one of the questions, in fact, it was question number 10, it had to do with fall fishing and fall bass locations. And several of the answers that were given were there, but Crumb81, big shout out to you, Crumb81, he got back to me in the text and said, Mark, I think you left out the fall turnover. Doesn't that have an impact on bass movement in the fall? He was absolutely right. Now, we covered it a little bit in the answer in terms of water temperatures and things like that. But Crumb81, you were right. That should have been a specific answer to the question that I didn't include. And it made me think, you know what? I got to cover this because we are finally, now that we're in October 20th or whatever today's date is, we're getting to the point where the water temperatures are changing. The water is starting to kind of get that murky look, which means the temperatures are evening out and that thermocline is disappearing, and basically we're entering fall turnover. It's a tricky time to fish. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what fall turnover is, just to refresh your memory, and then tell you what baits I think you should be using and where you should be looking to fish during that fall turnover. Guys, stick around. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Mark Fisher Outdoors, everybody. I'm Mark Fisher. Now, I've done videos on the fall turnover before, and you've seen diagrams like the one that I'm showing you, where in the summer, you see a clear stratification of the water. You see warm water on top. You see a mid-level area, which is called the thermocline. Remember, a thermocline is not a thin line. It is a layer of water that isn't quite as warm as the upper layer, but isn't as cold as the lower layer. And that thin layer of water, known as the thermocline, actually is the most high in oxygen and the coolest of the water found during the summer. But now, as we get to fall and we see the surface temperatures begin to cool off, as soon as those surface temperatures cool to the point where there really isn't any difference between the upper layer of the lake and the bottom layer of the lake, then what happens is the water just mixes. And two things about that. Number one, there's no clear difference in water temperature, but also oxygen levels are depleted throughout the lake because all of the oxygen molecules that were in the upper half of the lake above the thermocline are now spread out totally within the water column, everywhere from the surface to the lake floor bottom. And so there's less oxygen in the lake after the turnover. That's why you sometimes get that kind of funky smell. The lake color actually turns because it's mixing, and so it's not, being held down, and it is generally not as productive of a time to fish. But how do you know where to fish during the turnover or after the turnover? Well, the reality is that if you look at it from a standpoint of the variables that we follow throughout the year to fish. So you've got structure, you've got oxygen levels, you've got sunlight and or the shade from the sunlight, and you've got bait fish. Where's the bait fish? Okay, and where do they eat? What is it that they're eating? So if you have those four variables to try and figure out where are the bass, what you're really looking at now is one of those variables isn't present, but you still can rely on the other variables. And in fact, you have to put a little bit more emphasis on those other variables because they're the only ones you have. So in the fall, during the turnover or after the turnover, I'm going to keep those other variables in mind. I'm going to fish where there are brush piles, dock pilings, things like that. If it's a sunny day, I'm going to look for shade cover, whether it be under docks or on the opposite side of brush piles. Bait fish, if they've moved into the shallower coves, I'm going to follow where the bait fish are. If I'm seeing bait balls, I'm going to look for bass to be around bait balls on my screen and on my scope, things like that. Now, the other thing that I do have to say is I'm not going to completely just take oxygen level out of the equation, because if I've got a windy day, for example, and the wind is cheering up the top and the waves are well, that's actually going to bring oxygen levels to be a little bit higher up at the top. And so I am going to look at, hey, today is a day when the oxygen levels might be a little higher at the surface of the water. And so although I don't know that I'll fish top waters on a windy, choppy day, I might fish baits like a spinnerbait or something along those lines, chatterbait, that are subsurface but might go along the top there and where the oxygen levels are high. So the idea here is, guys, when you're in the fall turnover and you know that the oxygen levels are low, you absolutely want to be fishing the other variables that help you locate fish, whether it be objects like stumps, rocks, pier posts, brush piles. You also want to be looking at where the bait fish are, where are the fish feeding, what is it that they're feeding on, and make sure that you're going there. This is a time where I wouldn't be surprised if I've got a lot of rods on my deck, because I'm going to be doing a lot of things. A majority of the time, I'm going to be moving. I'm not going to sit in one place too long. The fish are spread out during the fall turnover. They can be anywhere. Where they once were 19 feet and above, I'm making that up, but on Lake Geneva, that's a typical thermocline level. So they're 20 feet and above. Now they could be anywhere. So I'm going to look everywhere, and I'm going to be checking shallow and deep and deeper and things like that. So I'm going to look at all different levels, which means I'm going to be looking and I'm going to be moving, and I'm not going to want to sit in one place very long. But if I'm moving along, say I'm throwing a topwater bait or a spinner bait or a chatterbait, and I'm moving along, and all of a sudden I get to up here. Now I'm going to put that down, maybe throw a jig or throw a NACO rig or something like that. And then all of a sudden I get to something else. Okay, I'm going to bounce a spinnerbait off of that cover or something along those lines. I'm going to want to have a lot of different options to fish the variable that presents itself. In the meantime, I'm going to be moving quick and moving along looking for those fish. It's a junk fishing time of year. I've said this before. After fall turnover, junk fishing prevails. You got to have a little bit of everything because you got to be looking at all of those variables. Guys, I hope this helps. Chrome81, nice job catching us on that. Hey, if you haven't seen that advanced bass fishing quiz, you really got to go back to it. Check it out. It was on last week on Thursday. Guys, I appreciate you tuning in. We'll see you again tomorrow on another episode of Mark Fisher Outdoors. Take care, everybody.